My sister Cordelia wasn't supposed to be there. The Navy SEALs had given her a direct order to evacuate with the other civilians, but when I saw her silhouette moving through that smoke-filled courtyard toward the sniper's nest, I knew she was about to either save us all or get herself killed trying. Before we dive and tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. I'm Staff Sergeant Thaddeus Morrison, and what I'm about to tell you happened in Afghanistan 3 years ago at Forward Operating Base Crimson. The woman walking straight into that kill zone was my little sister, Dr. Cordelia Morrison. She was 24 years old, barely 5'4", and she had never backed down from anything in her entire life. Not when we were kids and she climbed the neighbor's 40-foot oak tree on a dare. Not when she was 16 and our parents died in a car crash, leaving me to raise her through her senior year of high school. And definitely not that morning when 7 wounded soldiers were bleeding out in the middle of a Taliban ambush. See, Cordelia had arrived at our base just 3 days earlier with a medical relief convoy that got diverted due to enemy activity. She was there with Doctors Without Borders, doing what she always did, trying to save people who couldn't save themselves. I was stationed there as a Marine Corps intelligence officer, and honestly, when I first saw her step off that transport truck with her medical kit and that determined look in her eyes, my heart sank, because I knew my sister. I knew that stubborn streak that ran through her like steel wire, and I knew she was about to put herself in harm's way for people she'd never met before. Our relationship had always been complicated. After Mom and Dad died, I became more than her brother. I became her guardian, her protector, the one who made sure she ate dinner and did her homework and didn't take the kind of risks that could get her hurt. But Cordelia never saw it that way. To her, I was just her overprotective older brother who couldn't accept that she'd grown up to become one of the most skilled trauma surgeons in the country. The night before everything went wrong, we sat outside the mess tent under more stars than you can see anywhere in America, and she looked at me with those same determined eyes she'd had since she was 12 years old. "Thad, you can't keep treating me like I'm still that scared teenager who needed you to check under her bed for monsters. I've operated on gunshot victims in 3 different war zones. I've worked 18-hour shifts in field hospitals where the power went out every 20 minutes. I'm not here by accident, and I'm not here because I don't understand the risks." I wanted to tell her that it didn't matter how skilled she was or how much experience she had. I wanted to explain that in a combat zone, medical training doesn't stop bullets, and good intentions don't make you bulletproof. But I also knew that arguing with Cordelia was like trying to redirect a river with your bare hands. She was going to do what she believed was right, whether I supported her or not. What I didn't know was that less than 12 hours later, I'd be watching her make a decision that would either prove me right about the dangers she was taking, or prove her right about the risks she was willing to accept. What I didn't know was that by sunrise, my little sister would be walking directly into the most dangerous situation of her life, against direct orders from a Navy SEAL commander, with nothing but her medical training and a plan she'd figured out in about 30 seconds. And what I definitely didn't know was that her decision to ignore that evacuation order would end up saving 7 lives and changing everything I thought I understood about courage, fear, and what it really means to protect the people you love. Forward Operating Base Crimson sat in the middle of nowhere, Afghanistan, like a concrete island in an ocean of dust and danger. It wasn't the kind of place you'd choose to have a family reunion, but there I was, staring at my sister across a mess tent table, wondering how the hell she'd ended up in one of the most volatile regions in the entire country. The base itself was nothing fancy, just a collection of prefab buildings, sandbag barriers, and guard towers surrounded by razor wire, and the kind of tension that makes your shoulders ache even when you're trying to relax. We had about 200 personnel stationed there, mostly Marines and a SEAL team that rotated in and out on operations I wasn't cleared to know about. My job was intelligence gathering, which meant I spent most of my time analyzing enemy movement patterns and trying to predict where the next attack might come from. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was important, and it kept me busy enough that I didn't spend every waking moment worrying about Cordelia back home. Except now she wasn't back home. She was sitting right across from me, calmly eating military rations like she belonged there, and explaining how her medical convoy had been rerouted to our base after Taliban fighters had set up roadblocks along their original route to Kandahar. "So you're telling me that out of all the forward operating bases in Afghanistan, your convoy just happened to get diverted to mine?" I asked her, trying to keep the disbelief out of my voice. Cordelia smiled that same smile she'd been giving me since she was 8 years old, and I'd caught her sneaking cookies before dinner. "Pure coincidence, big brother. Though I have to admit, when I saw your name on the base roster, I may have requested to stay here instead of waiting for transport to continue our original mission." That was vintage Cordelia. She'd never been one to leave things to chance, and she'd certainly never been one to pass up an opportunity to prove a point. The point, in this case, being that she was perfectly capable of taking care of herself in dangerous situations without her overprotective brother hovering over her shoulder. I really looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived. 3 years of medical school, 2 years of residency, and 18 months working in conflict zones had changed her. She was still small, still had that determined set to her jaw that I remembered from childhood, but there was something different in her eyes now. A kind of steady confidence that came from knowing exactly what she was capable of under pressure. "You know, Thad, you don't have to worry about me anymore," she said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "I know what I'm doing out here." The thing is, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to look at my little sister and see the competent, experienced trauma surgeon that everyone else saw. But all I could see was the 16-year-old girl who'd cried herself to sleep for months after our parents died. The teenager who'd had panic attacks before her SATs because she was so afraid of letting me down. The young woman who'd called me sobbing from her dorm room freshman year because she was homesick and overwhelmed. "Remember when you were 12 and you decided you were going to learn how to skateboard?" I said. "You practiced for 3 weeks in secret, and then you announced you were ready to try the half-pipe at the skate park." "And I nailed it on the first try," she said, grinning. "After you broke your wrist on the second try," I reminded her. "But I nailed it on the first try," she repeated. "The point is I knew the risks, I prepared as much as I could, and I went for it anyway. That's not recklessness, Thad. That's calculated courage." I wanted to argue with her, but the truth was that Cordelia had always been braver than me. Even as a kid, she was the one who'd talk to the new students at school, who'd stand up to bullies twice her size, who'd volunteer to go first on the scary rides at the county fair. I'd spent so many years trying to protect her that I'd forgotten she'd never actually needed protecting in the first place. The next morning, I gave her a tour of the base, introducing her to the other Marines and showing her where everything was located. The guys in my unit were impressed by her credentials and her stories from other deployment zones. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who'd been in country for 8 months, told her she had more combat medical experience than most of the corpsmen he'd worked with. "Your sister's got steel in her spine," he told me later. "You can see it in how she carries herself. She's not here to play doctor and go home with some good stories. She's here to work." That evening, we walked the perimeter of the base together, talking about everything except the obvious danger we were both living in. She told me about the children's hospital she'd helped establish in Syria, about the refugee camps where she'd worked in Jordan, about the other doctors and nurses she'd met who dedicated their careers to helping people in the worst situations imaginable. "You know what the hardest part is?" she said as we stopped near the guard tower overlooking the main gate. "It's not the long hours or the primitive conditions or even the danger. It's knowing that no matter how many people you save, there are always more who need help. You have to learn to be okay with doing what you can and accepting that what you can do has limits." I looked at my sister standing there in her dusty cargo pants and medical corps t-shirt, watching the sun set over the Afghan mountains, and I realized that somewhere along the way, she'd become someone I didn't entirely recognize. She was still Cordelia, still stubborn and determined and unwilling to back down from a challenge, but she was also something more now. She was a person who'd found her purpose in the most dangerous places in the world, and she was good at it. What I didn't realize was that in less than 12 hours, that purpose and that skill would be put to a test that would change both of our lives forever. The attack came at 5:47 hours, just as the sun was starting to paint the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and pink. I was in the communications tent, reviewing overnight intelligence reports with my coffee still steaming, when the first mortar round hit the north wall of the base. The explosion shook the ground hard enough to knock my mug off the table and send hot coffee splashing across classified documents. "Incoming, all personnel to defensive positions," the alarm system screamed across the base as more rounds started falling. Through the tent flap, I could see Marines scrambling for cover, grabbing weapons and body armor, taking positions behind concrete barriers and sandbag walls. This wasn't random harassment fire. This was coordinated, precise, and it was coming from multiple directions. My first thought was Cordelia. Where was she? The medical tent was on the other side of the compound, near the helicopter landing zone, which also happened to be one of the most exposed areas of the base. I grabbed my rifle and body armor, checking my radio as I moved toward the door. "Base to all units, we have confirmed enemy contact from the northeast ridge line. Multiple shooters, estimate 12 to 15 Taliban fighters with mortars and small arms." The voice belonged to Major Harrison, our commanding officer, and even through the radio static, I could hear the tension in his voice. I made it halfway across the main courtyard before the sniper fire started. The first shot cracked past my ear close enough that I felt the displacement of air, and I dove behind a concrete blast barrier, my heart hammering against my ribs. That's when I saw them. 7 Marines caught in the open courtyard between the armory and the medical tent, all of them down, all of them bleeding. The closest one to me was Tommy Brixton from Iowa, barely 22 years old, who'd shown everyone pictures of his newborn daughter the night before. He was lying on his side about 40 meters away, clutching his abdomen, his uniform already dark with blood. Next to him was Corporal Davis, who'd taken shrapnel to his leg and was trying to crawl toward cover despite leaving a trail of blood behind him. Further out, I could see Martinez, Johnson, and 3 others I couldn't identify from this distance, all of them wounded, all of them trapped in the kill zone. "Sniper fire coming from the 2-story building, 200 meters northeast," someone shouted over the radio. "He's got the entire courtyard locked down." I keyed my radio. "This is Morrison. We've got 7 wounded in the open courtyard. They need immediate medical attention." "Copy that, Morrison. Medical team is en route." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie we were telling ourselves. Nobody was going to be able to reach those men, not with a sniper who had perfect sight lines on every approach route. We were trained for this kind of situation, and the textbook answer was clear. Neutralize the threat first, recover the wounded second. But textbook answers don't account for watching your friends bleed out while you wait for the perfect tactical solution. That's when I saw Cordelia. She was crouched behind a medical supply crate about 30 meters to my left, her trauma kit open beside her, staring at those wounded Marines with the same expression I'd seen on her face when she was 12, and decided she was going to climb that 40-foot oak tree. She was calculating, measuring distances and angles, figuring out if there was a way to make the impossible work. "Cordelia," I shouted over the gunfire, "stay where you are." She looked over at me, and I could see in her eyes that she was already gone, already committed to whatever plan was forming in her head. She'd seen Tommy Brixton show off those pictures of his baby daughter. She'd talked with Corporal Davis about his plans to propose to his girlfriend when he got home. These weren't just casualties to her. They were people she knew, people who were going to die if someone didn't do something right now. The SEAL team leader, Commander Barrett, came over the radio with the voice of absolute authority. "All medical personnel, you are ordered to evacuate to the secure bunker immediately. Repeat, all medical personnel evacuate now." I watched Cordelia's face as she heard that order. Her jaw set in that stubborn line I knew so well, the same expression she'd had when I'd told her she couldn't handle the advanced placement classes in high school, the same look she'd given me when I'd suggested maybe she should consider a safer career than trauma surgery. "Negative," she said into her radio, her voice steady as stone. "I have 7 critical patients who need immediate intervention. They've got maybe 10 minutes before they bleed out. The soldier by the supply truck, that's Tommy Brixton. He showed me pictures of his 3-month-old daughter yesterday, I'm not leaving them to die." Barrett's voice came back harder this time. "Dr. Morrison, this is not a request. You are ordered to stand down and evacuate with the other civilians. We will recover those men when we neutralize the threat." I could see Cordelia doing the math in her head, the same way she'd calculated the risk of that skateboard trick all those years ago. Tommy Brixton was losing blood fast. So was Davis. So were the others. In 10 minutes, some of them would be beyond saving. In 20 minutes, most of them would be dead. The tactical solution might work perfectly, but it would work too late. "Commander, with all due respect," Cordelia said, "by the time you neutralize that sniper, I'll be treating corpses instead of patients. These men don't have 20 minutes. I knew that tone. I'd been hearing it my entire life. It was the voice Cordelia used when she'd made up her mind about something and nothing in the world was going to change it. It was the voice of someone who'd rather face the consequences of action than live with the guilt of inaction. "Cordelia," I said, trying one last time, "please don't do this." She looked at me across that courtyard full of gunfire and wounded Marines, and I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen before. It wasn't recklessness or stubbornness or even courage. It was absolute certainty. She knew exactly what she was about to do, she understood the risks better than anyone, and she'd already made peace with whatever happened next. That's when she grabbed the smoke grenades. The moment Cordelia grabbed those smoke grenades, I knew there was no stopping her. She had that look in her eyes that I'd seen exactly 3 times in our lives. When she decided to climb that oak tree at age 12, when she'd announced she was going to medical school despite having no money for tuition, and when she'd told me she was going to work in war zones no matter what I said about it. It was the look of someone who'd already crossed the line between thinking about something and doing it. "Cordelia, don't you dare," I said. But she was already moving, pulling the pins on 2 smoke grenades and checking her medical kit one more time. "Remember when we were kids and you dared me to cross that frozen creek behind the Johnson farm?" she said, not looking at me, her hands working methodically to secure her medical supplies. "You said I'd never make it, that the ice was too thin, that I'd fall through and freeze to death before anyone could pull me out." I remembered. She'd been 10 years old, and I'd been trying to scare her away from what I thought was a dangerous situation. Instead, I'd given her motivation to prove me wrong. "I made it then, and I'm making it now," she continued, slinging her medical kit across her shoulder. "But I'm not doing this on a dare, Thad. I'm doing this because those men don't have a choice, and I do." That's when Commander Barrett's voice crackled over the radio again. "All units, be advised. We have movement in the building. Sniper is repositioning. Recommend all personnel maintain cover for the next 10 minutes while we coordinate an assault on the structure." 10 minutes? Cordelia looked at me, and I could see her doing the calculation. Tommy Brixton didn't have 10 minutes. Neither did Davis or Martinez or any of the others bleeding out in that courtyard. In 10 minutes, we'd be mounting a perfectly executed assault on a building to eliminate a sniper who'd already accomplished his mission of killing 7 American Marines. "I need you to watch him," Cordelia said, pulling out a pair of binoculars. "The sniper, I need to know his pattern." Despite every instinct telling me to tackle her and drag her to safety, I found myself taking the binoculars and focusing on the second-story window where the sniper had been firing from. For the next 90 seconds, I tracked his movements, noting how he shifted positions, how he targeted different areas of the courtyard, how he seemed to pause between shots. "He's moving every 12 seconds, I said. "Left side of the window, center, right side, then back. When he moves from right to center, there's a structural beam that blocks his view for about 3 seconds. That's your window." 3 seconds, she repeated. "I can work with 3 seconds." What happened next is something I'll replay in my mind for the rest of my life. Cordelia looked at me one more time, and for just a moment, she wasn't the confident trauma surgeon or the fearless humanitarian worker. She was my little sister, the girl who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, who cried when our goldfish died, who'd hugged me so tight when our parents died that I thought she might never let go. "If this goes wrong," she said quietly, "tell everyone I knew what I was doing. Tell them I wasn't being reckless. I've calculated the risks, and this is the right choice." "Cordelia," And tell Tommy's wife that he talked about her and the baby every single day. Tell her he was so proud to be a father that he carried 3 different pictures of their daughter in his wallet. Before I could respond, she was moving. She threw the first smoke grenade toward the center of the courtyard, then the second one toward the left side where most of the wounded were clustered. Gray smoke began billowing across the open ground, creating a curtain between the sniper and his targets. "What the hell is she doing?" Barrett's voice came over the radio, sharp with anger and disbelief. I had 2 choices. I could try to stop her, which would mean leaving my cover and probably getting both of us killed, or I could give her the best possible chance of survival by providing covering fire. It took me about half a second to make the decision. "Rodriguez, Johnson, I need suppressive fire on that building, 2nd floor, right now," I shouted into my radio. "Morrison, what's your status?" Barrett demanded. "My sister is crossing the courtyard to treat the wounded," I said, bringing my rifle up to my shoulder. "She's going with or without our help, so we're damn well going to help her." There was a pause, then Barrett's voice came back, resigned but professional. "All units, we have a civilian medical officer moving to assist wounded personnel. Provide covering fire on the structure, 2nd floor windows." I watched Cordelia move through the smoke like she'd been doing this her entire life. She stayed low, moved in short bursts, used every piece of cover available. When she reached Tommy Brixton, she didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees beside him and immediately began assessing his wounds, her hands moving with the kind of efficiency that comes from years of emergency medicine. But then something happened that none of us had anticipated. A second muzzle flash came from a different window, 20 feet to the left of where we'd been concentrating our fire. There was a second sniper, and we'd all missed him in our focus on the first shooter. The bullet struck the ground 6 inches from Cordelia's left knee, sending up a spray of dirt and concrete chips. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look up from Tommy's wound. She just kept working, applying pressure to the bleeding, checking his pulse, preparing him for movement. "Second shooter," I screamed into the radio. "2nd floor, left side window." That's when I realized the full scope of what Cordelia had walked into. This wasn't just dangerous, it was a death trap. 2 snipers with overlapping fields of fire, both of them now focused on the small figure in medical scrubs who was kneeling in their kill zone, completely exposed, trying to save a wounded Marine. And that's when Tommy Brixton, despite being shot in the abdomen and barely conscious, looked up at my sister and said something that changed everything. "Doc," Tommy Brixton whispered, his voice barely audible over the gunfire, "there's a drainage tunnel beneath this courtyard. My unit used it for supply runs last month. The entrance is 3 feet to your left, behind that pile of sandbags." I watched through my rifle scope as Cordelia's head snapped up, her eyes immediately scanning the area Tommy had indicated. Even with bullets cracking overhead and 2 snipers trying to kill her, she was processing what he'd told her, understanding the implications, calculating a new plan in real time. "How extensive is the tunnel system?" she asked Tommy, continuing to apply pressure to his abdominal wound while she spoke. "Connects to the whole compound," Tommy gasped. "Supply tunnel, maintenance, access, drainage. You can get anywhere from down there. We used to joke it was like a subway system under the base." That's when I saw it in Cordelia's eyes. Not just hope, but absolute certainty. She wasn't just going to save Tommy. She was going to save all of them. Every wounded Marine in that courtyard was going to make it out alive because my sister had just figured out how to turn an impossible situation into a solvable problem. "Tommy, I need you to stay conscious for me," she said, already moving toward the sandbags he'd indicated. "Can you move at all?" "I can crawl," he said through gritted teeth. "Not fast, but I can move." The second sniper fired again, this shot close enough to Tommy that it kicked dirt onto his uniform. Cordelia didn't even flinch. She was completely focused on the pile of sandbags, using her hands to move them aside until she found what Tommy had described. A concrete drainage cover, maybe 2 feet square, with enough space for a person to squeeze through if they didn't mind getting dirty. "Barrett, this is Morrison," I said into my radio, never taking my eyes off my sister. Cordelia found a tunnel system under the courtyard. She's going to extract the wounded through the drainage network. Negative, Barrett responded immediately. That tunnel system hasn't been cleared, could be booby-trapped, could be compromised. She needs to evacuate now. But Cordelia was already lifting the drainage cover, peering down into the darkness below. What she saw down there must have convinced her, because she turned to Tommy and said, "We're going underground. It's going to be dark, it's going to be tight, and it's going to hurt, but we're going to get you out of here." "Doc, I don't know if I can make it through a tunnel," Tommy said, his face pale from blood loss. "You made it through boot camp," Cordelia replied, checking his bandages one more time. "You made it through deployment. You made it through getting shot and lying in this courtyard for 20 minutes waiting for help. You can make it through a tunnel." What happened next was something I'd never seen before and hope I never have to see again. My sister, who weighed maybe 130 pounds soaking wet, lifted a wounded Marine who outweighed her by at least 60 pounds and helped him through that drainage opening. She didn't lower him down gently or wait for assistance. She just did what needed to be done, the way she'd been doing what needed to be done her entire life. Then she disappeared into the tunnel with him. For the next 45 minutes, I didn't know if my sister was alive or dead. The tunnel system was deep enough that radio contact was impossible. All I could do was coordinate with Barrett's team to provide covering fire and wait for some sign that Cordelia's plan was working. The first sign came when Corporal Davis appeared at the tunnel entrance near the medical tent, 100 meters from where he'd been shot. He was conscious, stabilized, and calling for stretcher bearers. 10 minutes later, Martinez emerged from a drainage outlet near the motor pool. Then Johnson, then 2 Marines I hadn't even realized were wounded, all of them coming up from different locations around the base, all of them treated and stabilized enough to move under their own power. "How is this possible?" Barrett asked over the radio. "My sister spent 45 minutes crawling through mud and concrete tunnels with nothing but a headlamp and a medical kit," I said, watching as another wounded Marine was helped to safety. "She's treating them underground where the snipers can't reach her, then sending them to extraction points all over the base." The last man out was Tommy Brixton. He emerged from the tunnel near the communications tent, carried on an improvised stretcher that Cordelia had made from tent poles and medical blankets. He was conscious, his bleeding controlled, and he was clutching something in his hand. It was a photograph of his baby daughter. "Where's your sister?" Barrett asked as we secured Tommy for transport to the field hospital. "Still down there," Tommy said. "She said she had to check all the tunnel connections to make sure nobody was left behind. She said that's what you do in medicine. You don't leave until everyone is accounted for." That was pure Cordelia. Even after performing emergency surgery in a drainage tunnel while under sniper fire, she was still thinking about the details, still making sure every possible wounded Marine had been reached and treated. She finally emerged from the tunnel system near the armory, covered in mud and concrete dust, her medical kit empty, her uniform torn but very much alive. When she saw me running toward her, she managed that same smile she'd been giving me since we were kids. "All 7 patients stabilized and extracted," she reported to Barrett, as if she were giving a routine medical update. "No fatalities, though Tommy and Davis are going to need surgery within the next few hours." Barrett just stared at her for a long moment, this small woman who just accomplished something that shouldn't have been possible. "Dr. Morrison," he said finally, "that was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the craziest thing I've ever seen." "Commander," Cordelia replied, "in my experience, there's not always a difference between the two." That's when the explosion started. Barrett's assault team had finally reached the building where the snipers were positioned, and the entire second floor erupted in smoke and debris. Both snipers were eliminated, but by then, it didn't matter. Every wounded Marine was already safe. 6 months later, I was sitting in my apartment in San Diego, staring at a photograph that had arrived in the mail that morning. It showed a chubby-cheeked baby girl in a pink dress, sitting in a high chair with birthday cake smeared all over her face and the biggest smile you've ever seen. On the back, Tommy Brixton had written, "Emma's first birthday. Thanks to your sister, I got to see it. Tell Dr. Morrison she's got a friend for life in Iowa." Tommy had made a full recovery. So had Davis, Martinez, Johnson, and the other 3 Marines whose names I'd learned later: Kowalski, Thompson, and Garcia. 7 men who should have died in that courtyard were instead living normal lives, going home to their families, watching their children grow up, all because my little sister had refused to accept that some situations are impossible. The official after-action report called it an unconventional medical evacuation executed under extreme combat conditions. What it didn't capture was the 45 minutes Cordelia had spent crawling through concrete drainage pipes in complete darkness, performing emergency surgery by headlamp, talking wounded Marines through their fear and pain while she worked to keep them alive. I found out later what those 45 minutes had really been like when Davis visited me during his recovery leave. He'd been conscious during most of his time in the tunnel, and he remembered every detail. "Your sister, she just kept talking to us," he said, sitting on my couch with his legs still in a brace. "Not medical talk, just regular conversation. She asked me about my girlfriend Sarah, about my plans to propose when I got home. She asked Tommy about his daughter, about what it felt like to be a new father. She kept us focused on the reasons we had to make it through." Davis paused, looking out the window toward the ocean. "The crazy part wasn't that she saved our lives. The crazy part was that she made us feel safe while she was doing it. Here we are, bleeding in a drainage tunnel while people are trying to kill us, and somehow she made it feel like we were going to be okay." That was Cordelia. She'd always had this ability to make other people feel like whatever challenge they were facing was manageable, like there was always a solution if you just looked at the problem from the right angle. I'd seen her do it with scared patients in emergency rooms, with overwhelmed students during her medical school rotations, and now with wounded Marines in the worst situation of their lives. 3 weeks after Davis's visit, I got a call from Cordelia herself. She was in Jordan, working at a refugee camp, treating families who'd fled the fighting in Syria. Her voice sounded exactly the same as always, calm, confident, focused on the work in front of her. "I heard Tommy sent you a picture of Emma's birthday," she said. "Isn't she beautiful?" "Cordelia," I said, "we need to talk about what happened in Afghanistan." "What about it?" I'd been rehearsing this conversation for months, trying to figure out how to express everything I'd been feeling since that morning at Forward Operating Base Crimson. How proud I was of what she'd accomplished. How terrified I'd been watching her walk into that courtyard. How wrong I'd been about her capabilities and her judgment. "I spent most of our lives thinking I needed to protect you," I said finally. "I thought you were reckless, that you took unnecessary risks, that you didn't understand how dangerous the world could be." "And now," she asked. "Now I realize I had it backwards. You weren't taking risks because you didn't understand the danger. You were taking risks because you understood something I didn't." "Which was?" "That sometimes the biggest risk is not acting at all. That sometimes protecting people means putting yourself in harm's way. That calculated courage isn't the same thing as recklessness." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Cordelia spoke again, her voice was softer than I'd heard it in years. "Thad, you didn't fail to protect me all those years. You gave me the foundation I needed to protect other people. Every time you made sure I did my homework, every time you drove me to school when I was running late, every time you stayed up with me when I was stressed about exams, you were teaching me that taking care of people matters. You were showing me what responsibility looks like." I hadn't expected that. I'd been so focused on apologizing for doubting her that I hadn't considered she might see our relationship differently than I did. "You know what I thought about when I was in that tunnel with Tommy and Davis," she continued. "I thought about the time when I was 8 and I fell off my bike and scraped up my knees pretty badly. You didn't just put Band-Aids on the cuts. You sat with me until I stopped crying, and then you helped me get back on the bike so I wouldn't be afraid of it." I remembered that day. Cordelia had been so proud of learning to ride without training wheels, and then she'd hit a patch of gravel and gone down hard. She'd been more embarrassed than hurt, but I'd treated it like a major medical emergency because that's what big brothers do. "That's what I was doing in Afghanistan," she said. "I was helping people get back on the bike. I was showing them they didn't have to be afraid." The following spring, Cordelia received the Secretary of Defense Medal for exceptional civilian service. The ceremony was held at the Pentagon, and I wore my dress uniform. Standing in the front row as a general I'd never met described my sister's actions as an extraordinary demonstration of courage and medical skill under combat conditions. But the moment that really mattered happened afterward, when we were walking to the parking garage, and Cordelia stopped to look back at the building. "You know what the best part of all this is?" she said. "What's that?" "Tommy's daughter Emma is going to grow up with her father. Davis is getting married to Sarah next month. Martinez started college last fall on the GI Bill. Those men get to have the lives they planned because I spent 45 minutes in a drainage tunnel." She looked at me with that same determined expression she'd had since childhood, but now I understood what I was seeing in her eyes. It wasn't stubbornness or recklessness or even courage. It was love, love for people she'd never met before that morning, love strong enough to walk into a kill zone, love that calculated every risk and decided that some things are worth dying for, which makes them definitely worth living for. My sister didn't walk into that courtyard fearlessly. She walked into it because her fear of losing those Marines was stronger than her fear of dying. And that's not courage despite fear. That's courage because of love.